The psychology of ego death. What it actually means to kill your old self. You felt it before. That moment when you realize the person you've been isn't who you're supposed to be. Maybe it hit you after a breakup. Maybe after losing a job. Maybe in the middle of the night when you couldn't sleep and the truth you'd been avoiding finally caught up with you. Something has to die. Not metaphorically. Not kind of. The version of you that got you here, the one with the limiting beliefs, the protective mechanisms, the identity you built to survive, that version has to go. This is ego death. And it might be the most important psychological event you'll ever experience. Part 1. The self you think you are. Here is something neuroscience discovered that changes everything. There's a network in your brain called the default mode network, the DMN. It was first identified by neuroscientist Marcus Raichle in 2001, and it's active when you're not focused on the outside world, when you're daydreaming, remembering the past, imagining the future, thinking about yourself. The DMN is essentially the neural basis of your ego. It creates what researchers call a coherent internal narrative. Your sense of who you are, your autobiography, your identity, the story you tell yourself about yourself. This is the you that wakes up in the morning and knows your name, your history, your preferences, your fears. The continuous thread of selfhood that makes you feel like the same person you were yesterday. But here's where it gets wild. This self, this identity you've built, isn't fixed. It's not permanent. It's not even real in the way you think it is. It's a construction, a story your brain tells to make sense of experience. And that story can be rewritten. Part 2. When the story breaks. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who spent his career mapping the depths of the psyche, called it psychic death. He defined it as a fundamental reordering of the psyche with the liberating potential to reset human consciousness so that it might better align with the natural self. Read that again. Ego death isn't destruction. It's liberation. It's your consciousness resetting so it can align with who you actually are, not who you were programmed to be. Jung understood something that modern neuroscience is now confirming. The identity you're walking around with isn't your true self. It's a protective shell, a survival mechanism, an operating system you downloaded from your environment before you had the ability to choose. Your parents installed beliefs. Society installed expectations. Your traumas installed defense mechanisms. And all of it became you. But it was never you. The ego is necessary. It helps you navigate the world. But when it becomes rigid, when it becomes the master instead of the servant, it starts to limit what's possible. This is why people feel stuck. They're not actually stuck. Their ego won't let them move. Part 3. What happens in the brain? Neuroscience has given us a window into what ego death actually looks like. When researchers at Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London studied people undergoing ego dissolution, whether through meditation, psilocybin, or intense experiences, they found something consistent. The default mode network goes quiet. Activity in the DMN decreases. The communication between its key hubs, the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, weakens. The network that creates your sense of self temporarily loses its grip. And when that happens, something remarkable occurs. People report feeling a dissolution of boundaries. The sense of being a separate self, distinct from the world around them, fades. They experience what researchers call ego dissolution or unity experiences. But here is the part that matters for transformation. The experience increases what scientists call brain entropy. The number of functional connections throughout the brain increases. New pathways form. Old rigid patterns break down. In other words, ego death creates the neurological conditions for change. This is why people report lasting shifts after these experiences. It's not just psychological. It's structural. The brain literally reorganizes. Part 4. The two faces of dissolution. Not all ego death is the same. Researchers have identified two distinct components to ego dissolution. Understanding this might save you years of confusion. The first is the annihilational component. This is when your sense of bodily self, your self-boundaries, your self-salience, all of it dissolves. This can feel terrifying. It's the death part of ego death. The ground disappearing beneath you. This component can go dark. It's associated with depersonalization, dissociation, and in extreme cases, psychotic episodes. When the ego resists its own dissolution, the experience can feel like you're losing your mind. The second is the relational component. This is when the dissolution leads to a sense of unity, connection with others, with nature, with something larger than yourself. This is the mystical aspect. The profound sense that you're part of something infinite. Both components are real. Both happen. The difference between a breakthrough and a breakdown often comes down to context, preparation, and integration. Here's what this means for you. Ego death isn't something you force. It's something you allow. And when it comes, through crisis, meditation, or the weight of your own contradictions, Your job is to surrender to it rather than fight it. Part 5. The doorways. You don't need psychedelics for ego death. Though they're the most studied pathway in recent research, they're not the only door. Meditation is one of the oldest and most reliable methods. Research by Lindahl and Britton found that 72% of Buddhist meditators experienced an alteration in their sense of self during practice. Long-term meditators show decreased DMN functional connectivity, the same pattern seen in psychedelic ego dissolution. Buddhism has known this for thousands of years. Gene Y. Park describes meditation as learning how to die by learning to forget the sense of self. Near-death experiences trigger ego dissolution. When your survival is threatened at the deepest level, the brain's normal self-construction processes can collapse. People who survive often report profound shifts in their relationship to fear, death, and what matters. Trauma can force ego death. Not because trauma is good, it isn't, but because extreme circumstances can shatter the identity you've been carrying. The person who emerges from deep crisis is often fundamentally different from the one who entered it. Intense emotional experiences, profound grief, overwhelming joy, moments of awe, can crack the ego's shell. In these moments, the boundaries of self soften. You transcend your usual cognitive limitations. And sometimes, ego death comes simply from hitting a wall. When the gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be becomes unbearable. When the mask gets too heavy. When the lie gets too loud. This is often what people call a spiritual awakening. The NPC wakes up. Part 6. The terror and the gift. Let's be honest about what this feels like. Ego death is not comfortable. The ego has a protective function. When it gets stripped away, you can feel untethered, like you don't know who you are or what's real. There's a reason people resist this. There's a reason you've probably been avoiding it. The identity you've built, even if it's limiting you, even if it's making you miserable, is familiar. It's known. And the unknown is terrifying. Psychologist Gay Hendricks calls this the upper limit problem. We have a thermostat for how much success, love, and aliveness we can tolerate. When we exceed it, we unconsciously sabotage ourselves to return to familiar territory. Ego death requires exceeding that limit permanently. But here is what's on the other side. People who undergo ego dissolution report lasting changes. A quieter mind, reduced fear of death, a decreased need for external validation, a sense of connection to something larger. They report becoming unstuck. The self-torture that the ego specializes in, the rumination, the comparison, the endless self-criticism, loses its power. Dr. Steve Taylor studied 25 people who experienced what he called transformational spiritual awakening. The most common characteristics: positive effect on well-being, greater presentness, and a stable state of being that persisted. This isn't temporary. This isn't a peak experience that fades. This is structural change. Part 7. Integration, the part nobody talks about. Here is where most people get it wrong. Ego death is not the destination. It's the doorway. What matters is integration, the process of weaving the insight into daily life. Psychedelics researcher Robin Carhart Harris puts it this way. Psychedelics are not magic pills. They're not substitutes for the long, soulful journey of healing and self-discovery. True transformation happens through integration. This is why some people have profound experiences and nothing changes. They touch ego death. They glimpse another way of being, and then they snap back to their old identity. The ego is resilient. It will rebuild itself. It will reconstruct the same stories, the same limitations, the same patterns, unless you consciously architect something different. Integration requires 3 things. First, making sense of the experience. What did you see? What did you feel? What did you understand that you didn't understand before? Second, embodying the insight. Not just knowing it intellectually, but living it. Making decisions from the new understanding. Taking actions that reflect who you're becoming. Third, building structures that support the new identity. Environment, relationships, habits. The old self was maintained by an entire ecosystem. The new self needs its own. Jung called this individuation, the process of integrating unconscious contents into consciousness to form a whole self. You don't just kill the ego and walk away. You rebuild it. Consciously this time. Intentionally. Part 8. The reconstruction. This is the part that matters most. After ego death comes ego reconstruction. Not going back to who you were, but building something new. Psychologists call this identity-level transformation. It's not changing your behavior. It's changing the core beliefs about who you are. The old self was built unconsciously. You absorbed beliefs without choosing them. You formed an identity based on what you needed to survive. The new self gets built on purpose. This is where the real work happens. Not in the dissolution, but in the reconstruction. Not in the dying, but in the becoming. You get to choose now. What beliefs serve who you want to be? What patterns support the life you want to live? What identity would make your goals inevitable? James Clear writes about this in Atomic Habits. Behavior change that contradicts your identity won't stick, but behavior that aligns with your identity feels effortless. The person who has undergone ego death has a unique advantage. They're not trying to change an identity. They're building one from scratch. The truth. Here is what nobody tells you about ego death. You've probably already experienced small versions of it. Every time you outgrew an old version of yourself. Every time you looked back at who you were 5 years ago and couldn't recognize that person. Every time a belief you held absolutely crumbled under new evidence. These are mini ego deaths. Practice runs. The big one, the full dissolution, the complete breakdown of who you thought you were. That one requires something more. It requires willingness to let everything you've built burn down. Not everyone will do this. Most people will keep patching the old identity, keep reinforcing the walls, keep protecting the ego that's limiting them. They'll optimize the prison instead of breaking out. But you're reading this, which means something in you already knows. The version of you that's been running the show, the one with the fears and the limitations and the stories about what you can't do, that version isn't serving you anymore. And on some level, you've already begun to let it go. The question isn't whether ego death is coming. It comes for everyone eventually, through crisis or growth, through choice or circumstance. The question is whether you'll resist it or ride it, whether you'll cling to who you were or step into who you're becoming. The old self has to die for the new self to live. That's not tragedy. That's the design.